Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're tackling a really big question. Why isn't blockchain, well, everywhere yet? We're going to look at the core problems holding it back and how one particular project was built from the ground up to solve them.
All right, let's just jump right in. For years, right, we've all heard the hype that blockchain and Web3 are the next big thing, the future of the internet. But for most people, it just hasn't really clicked. So what's the deal? What's holding it all back?
Well, for a lot of us, the promise of this super fast, easy, accessible new internet, it just hasn't matched up with the reality. Instead of being simple, the experience is often painfully slow, surprisingly expensive, and honestly, it can be pretty intimidating if you're not already deep in the weeds. Yeah, this huge gap between the hype and the reality, it really boils down to two giant hurdles that have seriously slowed down mainstream adoption. So let's break them down. First up, you've got the scalability problem. What happens is, when a network actually gets popular, it can slow to a crawl. And those transaction fees, the gas fees, they can just skyrocket. It creates this totally unsustainable system. I mean, imagine trying to buy a $5 digital collectible, but having to pay a $40 transaction fee. For everyday use, that model is it's broken.
And then there's the second hurdle. Usability. Look, a lot of this tech was built by brilliant engineers for other brilliant engineers, and that's created a really frustrating experience for, well, everyone else. You know what I'm talking about, those ridiculously long wallet addresses, all the confusing jargon, and that constant nagging fear that you're going to make one tiny mistake and poof, all your funds are gone.
Okay, so if those are the problems, what's the solution? Well, this is where Near Protocol comes into the picture. It's a project that, from day one, made solving these two exact problems, scalability and usability, its absolute core mission.
Their whole vision was super direct. It wasn't just about building a faster blockchain, it was about building one that people could actually use. Something that feels just as familiar and easy as the apps you're already using every single day.
All right, so let's get into how Near is actually built to tackle all this. Starting with that first massive problem, the need for serious speed and super low costs. The core innovation here is something called sharding, which is actually a concept borrowed from traditional database design. The idea is, instead of forcing the entire network to process every single transaction in one long single file line, which you can imagine gets clogged up fast, sharding breaks that whole workload up.
And the analogy for this, it's actually super simple. Think about it. A single cashier at a bank can only help so many people. But what happens when you open up 10 cashier windows? The lines basically disappear, and everything moves way, way faster. That's exactly what sharding does for a blockchain network. It opens up all these parallel lanes for transactions to fly through. Now, Near-specific design for this is called Nightshade. Here's how it works. The network's workload gets split into these parallel processing lanes, which are the shards. Each shard handles its own little batch of transactions and produces what's called a chunk. Then all of these chunks get bundled together into one single secure block on the main chain. So you get this massive parallel processing power, but you still keep the rock-solid security of a single blockchain.
So what does all this techie stuff actually mean for you, the user? It means your transaction gets finality, which is just a fancy way of saying it's confirmed and totally irreversible in about 1 to 2 seconds. Seriously, not minutes, not hours, we're talking seconds. That is the kind of speed you need for real-world applications to actually work.
But like we said, speed is only half the battle, right? So let's flip over to how Near tackles that other giant hurdle, making this technology simple and, actually intuitive to use. And this is where the difference is just night and day. Instead of one of those typical anxiety-inducing crypto addresses that look like a cat walked on your keyboard, Near uses a simple, human-readable name. Yep, just like a username or an email address.
And look, this is so much more than just convenience. It's a fundamental shift in user experience. When you can easily read and double-check where you're sending something, it builds trust. It gets rid of that constant fear of the catastrophic typo, that one little mistake that could cost you everything. And that fear, that's what's kept so many people on the sidelines of Web3. And this whole philosophy of simplicity, it's woven into everything they do. The goal is to let new users sign up with methods they already know, like email, to design wallets that just make sense, to keep costs so low that anyone, anywhere can participate, and of course, to make sure the whole shebang works perfectly on your phone. So, when you put these two things together, that world-class speed and this radical simplicity, what does that actually mean for the future of the internet? Where does this all lead? Well, the ultimate goal is to make the blockchain itself just
disappear. Think about it. You use email every single day without ever thinking about the complex SMTP protocol that makes it all work in the background. That's the future for blockchain. It becomes the powerful, secure, but completely invisible infrastructure that a whole new generation of apps can be built on.
And that really brings us to the key takeaway here. True game-changing innovation, it isn't about piling on more and more features. It's about relentlessly removing friction and complexity for the actual people using the thing.
And that leaves us with one final, and I think really powerful, question to chew on. If using blockchain felt as simple and as normal as sending an email, what could we build? What kinds of new ideas, new businesses, new communities would finally become possible? That right there is the future that a protocol like Near is really trying to unlock.